Hey there, sleepyheads. Welcome back to the channel. Before we drift into 2 hours of global alien encounters you were never told about to fall asleep, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below, because honestly, it's always magical seeing how far and wide this sleepy little community reaches. From the misty mountains of Nepal to the pizza-scented basements of New Jersey, you never know who's tuning in under the same stars. All right? Lights low, blankets up. And if your cat is snuggled somewhere near your feet, tell it to watch the skies. Let's begin. In the heart of northern Brazil, where the rainforest breathes like a living thing and the rivers wind through the land like ancient silver threads, there is a quiet village hidden just beyond the trees. It's not on most maps. Even the locals will sometimes smile and say, it's somewhere between where the road ends and the stories begin. The kind of place where people don't check the time because the sun, the birds, and the smell of food cooking in the breeze tell you everything you need to know. In this village lived a man named Hugo, a fisherman. Not the kind who bragged about big catches or wore expensive gear, but the quiet kind. The kind who knew the river like it was family. He had lines on his face, not from age, but from squinting into sunlight, and a posture shaped by years of rowing through currents and mist. One late evening, the kind when the air feels heavy with the weight of dreams, Hugo went down to the riverbank. The sky was painted in deep oranges and purples. The trees whispered gently as if they too were trying to settle in for the night. Hugo carried with him the same old net he had used for years. It had knots in the corners, a small tear that he kept meaning to fix, and the smell of river, life embedded into every thread. He cast the net into the water and waited. Everything was still. The kind of stillness that almost hums with silence. Then, just as the last of the light vanished from the sky, he saw it. At first, it looked like a reflection, a glow on the surface of the river, perfectly round, soft and white. But there was no moon that night, and the glow didn't ripple with the current. It sat on the water like a pearl resting on velvet. Hugo leaned forward. The glow pulsed, gently, like it was breathing. Then, slowly, it began to rise. Not splash, not surge, not shake, just lift. A soft, weightless movement, like a bubble escaping the depths. The object rose out of the water until it hovered a few feet above. The river, completely silent. Its light didn't blind. It soothed. Not white, not blue, not silver. Something in between. The kind of color that only exists when you're not quite awake. Hugo stared. His first thought wasn't fear. It wasn't even confusion. It was a strange and sudden sense of peace, as if something had pressed pause on the world and given him a few stolen seconds outside of time. The light held steady. Then it drifted, ever so slowly, toward the shore. Hugo stepped back instinctively, but the glow stopped mid-air, hovered, waited, as though it didn't want to startle him. And then it moved again, this time upward, higher, until it cleared the tree line. It paused once more, pulsing rhythmically, and then, without warning, shot, straight into the sky. No sound, no trail, just gone. The forest remained still, the river calm. Hugo stood for a long time looking at the space where the light had been. He didn't try to explain it to himself, didn't give it a name. Just stood there, as if his body was waiting for his mind to catch up. When he returned home that night, his wife asked if he'd caught anything. He said no, but smiled as he said it, because even though his basket was empty, he felt like he'd brought something back with him, something that couldn't be fried or sold or measured by weight. The next morning, strange things began to happen. Not frightening things, not dramatic ones, just odd, quiet little changes. The place where the orb had risen from the water stayed warmer than the rest of the river. Not hot, just pleasantly warm. The villagers noticed. Some started bathing there, said it made their joints ache less, said it felt like swimming in sunlight. Fish began gathering in that spot, not feeding, not spawning, just hovering, like they too were remembering something. Hugo's old fishing net, the one he'd used that night, never absorbed water the same way again. It dried within minutes, shimmered, slightly in the sun. Children whispered that it glowed. Elders frowned and crossed themselves. People talked. Some said Hugo had seen a spirit. Others said it was a sign, good or bad, depending on who you asked. A few quietly said the word extraterrestre, with more curiosity than fear. But Hugo? He just kept going back to the river, sitting on the bank, watching the water. Not to fish, not even to wait, just to be there. Weeks passed. One night, as he sat under the stars, he noticed something strange in the trees across the river. Not a glow, not a sound, just a feeling, a presence, like the forest had remembered him and wanted to say something. Hugo didn't speak, didn't move, he just listened. And maybe that's why it returned. One night, long after everyone had gone to sleep, Hugo saw the light again. Not rising from the water this time, but drifting slowly down from the sky, like a paper lantern caught in reverse. It hovered above the same spot, pulsed once, twice, 3 times. Then, gently, it sank into the river and vanished. No splash, no ripple, just gone. From then on, the villagers began calling that part of the river O Suspiro do Ceu, the sky's sigh. It became a quiet sort of legend, not one people told loudly or to strangers, but a story shared during lazy afternoons and firelit dinners. A story told with a shrug and a smile. Maybe it was real, maybe not, but there was something about it that made people feel smaller in the best way, like a gentle reminder that the universe was vast and strange and full of soft lights we didn't yet understand. Hugo never tried to prove what he saw. He never asked for attention. He simply kept living. Grew vegetables in his backyard. Tended to his boat. Sometimes he'd sit in silence by the water and look up at the stars. People would ask if he ever saw it again. He'd just smile and say, "Sometimes." And that was enough. There's something about the way he said it that made you believe him. Not just believe the light was real, but believe that maybe, just maybe, the sky occasionally leans down to whisper to the ones who are quiet enough to listen. No photos, no evidence. Just a man, a river, and a light that rose one night without warning. And maybe that's how the best stories should be told. Not shouted, not sold, just remembered. Because sometimes the most extraordinary things happen in the quietest places, at the quietest times, to the quietest people. And if you ever find yourself in northern Brazil, standing beside a river that hums a little louder than it should, take a moment. Look up, feel the air, and if you're lucky, you might just catch a glimpse of something floating, glowing, breathing softly in the night. Something that doesn't need to explain itself. Something that's just passing through. Like a sigh from the sky. And so, there he stood, Osvaldo in his flip-flops and threadbare t-shirt, staring up at this silent, gleaming orb as if he were waiting for it to ask him for directions. The river below shimmered, as if coated in liquid moonlight, though there wasn't a single cloud, or moon, for miles. The orb hovered, utterly still, its light neither blinding nor dim, more like the glow of a lantern carried by a polite ghost. He remembered something odd. The birds had stopped. Not just slowed. Stopped. The jungle, which usually hummed with the gossip of frogs, cicadas, and the occasional annoyed monkey, had gone entirely quiet. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you've wandered onto a stage mid-performance. The villagers would later tell him that it lasted only minutes, but to Osvaldo, it felt like time forgot how to walk. He blinked, and in that blink, the orb wasn't above the river anymore. It was behind the treetops, and then gone. No whoosh, no crackle, not even the polite goodbye of a breeze. You'd think that would be the end of the story, but the real weirdness was still packing its bags. When Osvaldo returned home the next morning, after sleeping on the canoe because, frankly, he wasn't sure the ground wasn't going to float away too, he noticed something strange. His bananas had ripened. Overnight. All of them. Bright yellow, sweet-smelling, and ready for market. Now, for a man whose primary struggle in life was getting fruit to behave according to a predictable timeline, this was either a blessing or alien sabotage. He tried not to overthink it. That is, until he got to the village square. Osvaldo wasn't the only one who'd seen it. Maria, the shopkeeper's wife, said she'd seen her ceiling lamp flicker like a disco ball. Her husband swore the chickens laid square and eggs that night. No one believed him, and frankly, neither did the chickens, who seemed embarrassed the next morning. And Jorge, who lived 3 houses down and had the telescope he claimed was for astronomy and not spying on neighbors, well, he had taken a photo. Sort of. It was blurry, predictably. Like all good UFO photos, it looked like it had been taken by a mildly startled potato. But there was something, a faint glow in the night, just above the waterline, suspended, still, eerily similar to what Osvaldo described. For weeks, no one could stop talking about it. But oddly, no one felt scared. That was the part that puzzled even the elders. Usually, with these stories, yes, even in Brazil, you get people whispering about curses, about angry sky spirits, or government experiments involving invisible monkeys. But here, the general consensus was, whatever it was gentle. Almost curious. One old man, Senor Claudio, said it best during a communal dinner under the stars. He leaned back in his creaky chair, took a long sip of his guarana, and said, "If they came to hurt us, they'd have started with Jorge's music." Jorge played the accordion. Badly. There was, however, one moment that continued to unnerve Osvaldo. About 3 days after the encounter, he went to visit his fishing spot again, half expecting, half hoping, to see the glowing orb once more. Instead, he found something else, a set of footprints. Not human, at least, not quite. They weren't deep, but they were wide and perfectly round, each one the size of a dinner plate and arranged in a spiral pattern. No animal in the Amazon walked like that, not even the drunk tapirs. He knelt down to examine them, lightly tracing one with his fingers. It was warm, not hot, just warm, as if the sun had kissed that patch of earth more generously than the rest. And nearby, a plant he'd never seen before was blooming, its petals glistening like metal, with a subtle pulse of pale green light. He plucked one, pressed it between the pages of his notebook, and swore it changed color every day. No one else could see it change, though, which made him wonder if maybe the alien encounter had come with a free subscription to mild hallucinations. Months passed. The river went back to whispering its lazy lullabies. The birds resumed their noisy arguments. Jorge returned to serenading the town with his accordion, to the collective dismay of every living creature within earshot. But something stayed with Osvaldo. He'd fish the same way, live the same way, even nap the same way. But some evenings, just before sleep, he'd swear he could feel it. Again, that strange warmth in the air, that hush of an invisible presence, not threatening, not even really alien anymore, just familiar. It made him wonder, what if they weren't visitors? What if they were neighbors, just with a really strange schedule? He told no one, mostly because no one would understand, but also because, deep down, he liked the idea of being part of a secret. A cosmic wink, a quiet moment shared between two different worlds. And then one day, the plant bloomed again. Only this time, the petals didn't pulse. They hummed, very softly, like the last note of a lullaby that refuses to end. Osvaldo smiled, closed his notebook, and went fishing. Because if the aliens ever came back, he figured they'd want to try the tilapia. And he knew just the spot. It begins in a place where silence isn't a visitor, but a resident. A tiny village in the northern expanse of Russia, far past where the roads forget their names, wrapped tightly in a blanket of endless white. Here, snow doesn't fall. It settles gently, like the world itself is exhaling. The trees groan beneath the weight of winter. And the wind doesn't howl. It whispers, in a language only the frost seems to understand. In this village, Karskova, population 42 on a busy day, people speak softly, walk slowly, and drink tea as if it's a sacred ritual. Most homes are painted a faded green or powder blue, chipped by time and snowflakes, and held together more by memory than by nails. This is where our story begins, one January evening, during a winter so cold even the shadows refused to move. Natalia Ivanovna, a retired schoolteacher with a soft spot for crossword puzzles and an unreasonably intelligent cat named Misha, was the first to hear it. Not a noise, exactly. A whisper. It came while she was feeding Misha near the window, watching flakes drift sideways in the wind like little daydreams. She heard her name, not spoken, not shouted, but breathed, as if the snow outside had lungs. She turned, of course. No one was there. Now you should know, Natalia wasn't the jumpy type. She'd survived Soviet winters, power outages, and a marriage that lasted through 3 decades and 6 different brands of wallpaper. A ghostly whisper was not going to rattle her. But still, she was curious. So she stepped outside, pulling her thick coat tight, her boots crunching over the frozen path. That's when she saw the footprints. Only they weren't footprints, not really. More like indentations, perfectly symmetrical ovals, spaced precisely apart, as if whoever or whatever made them didn't walk, but hovered, occasionally deciding to politely touch down. They led away from her house and into the forest. Now, most Russians, when faced with mysterious glowing indentations leading into an eerie forest, would reasonably choose tea, a blanket, and pretending nothing happened. But Natalia, fueled by a mix of boredom and a strangely adventurous mood brought on by cabbage soup, decided to follow. The forest was dense, every branch heavy with frost. The trees whispered, too, not with wind, but with memory, like they were holding in secrets, unsure whether to spill them or keep them locked beneath the bark. And then she saw it. A clearing, small, barely the size of a living room rug, but in the middle, something hovered. Not high, just above the snow. A shape, smooth, oval, about the size of a car door, turned on its side. It shimmered faintly like a heat mirage made of silver and moonlight. And there was sound, gentle, almost melodic. Not a hum, but a series of pulses, rhythmic, soft, and oddly warm. Natalia stood there, barely breathing. Even Misha, who had quietly followed her this entire time without her noticing, sat beside her. Ears perked, tail twitching, not from fear, but curiosity. The object didn't move, didn't shine brighter. It simply was, as if it had always been there, waiting for someone calm enough, quiet enough to notice. After a long while, perhaps minutes, perhaps hours, she stepped forward. The snow around the object was untouched. It hadn't melted, hadn't swirled. It was simply absent. A clean circle of stillness. And then, without warning or fanfare, the object dimmed. Not vanished, just faded, like a thought leaving the edge of your mind. And in its place, something remained. A stone, small, smooth, Not from any local river, she knew. It was matte gray, warm to the touch and faintly pulsing. She picked it up, and when she did, she heard it again. That whisper, but this time clearer. It wasn't a language, she knew. Not Russian, not Latin, not anything you find in the back of a Soviet encyclopedia. But she understood it. Emotionally, if not linguistically. It said, "We listen. That's all." Now, you might think this would cause some sort of panic. But no. Natalia simply nodded, slipped the stone into her coat pocket, and went home. Misha trotted beside her, smug as ever. She didn't tell anyone. Not at first. What would she say? "Hello, I heard snow whispering and picked up a psychic rock." Besides, she figured, some secrets prefer to sleep a little longer. But strange things began happening. Her plants, long dormant in the frost-bitten months, began to sprout. Just a little. Green buds, confused by the season but persistent, nonetheless. Her old radio, broken since 1998, began to catch frequencies again. But not stations, just gentle sounds. Melodies that didn't follow any earthly scale. Calming. Dreamlike. And at night, when she held the stone, she could hear them. Not voices, not commands, just thoughts, kindnesses, echoes of peace, an apology for intruding, perhaps, or maybe just a hello from the other side of comprehension. Weeks passed. The village went on, as always. Sasha still argued with the grocer about expired pickles. The town hall clock still ran, 10 minutes slow, and the local postman still insisted his dog had once barked at a ghost. But to Natalia, the world had changed. One night, she decided to return to the clearing. The forest greeted her like an old friend. The air was still, thick with anticipation. And there it was again. Not the object this time, but light. Faint, pale blue, flickering like the shimmer of frost beneath moonlight, hovering just above the place where she'd found the stone. And within that glow, shapes. Not bodies, not shadows, but impressions. The feeling of being watched by someone with no eyes, the presence of a presence wrapped in intention. They didn't speak, but she understood. They weren't here to conquer, or save, or study. They were here to listen, to learn the language of snowflakes and grandmothers, of steaming tea and silent understanding, of the way humans, even frozen ones, hold on to dreams like embers. The next morning, she found the footprints again, this time leading away from the forest, to other homes, as if the whispers had chosen to expand their vocabulary. Slowly, others began to feel it too. Small things, quiet dreams, a sudden deep calm. Even the grumpy butcher, Ivan, claimed his sleep had improved, though he insisted it was thanks to a new mattress. No one believed him, of course, mostly because no one had seen a mattress delivery in town since 2004. Natalia never shared her stone, but she didn't need to. Its warmth spread, like a ripple across a lake made of thought. And one by one, the villagers began sleeping a little deeper, smiling a little softer, hearing, just faintly, the snow whispering back. Years later, when the snow finally melted in a spring unusually kind, a researcher visited the town, young, ambitious, armed with notebooks and devices that beeped far too loudly. He was studying reports of emotional anomalies, a rise in shared dreaming, unusual energy patterns, local legends. He asked Natalia if she'd seen anything strange. She smiled, offered him tea, and pointed to Misha, who was currently balancing on the windowsill like a furry statue of smugness. "Only the usual," she said. "Because sometimes you don't need to tell a story out loud. Sometimes the snow does it for you." The next morning, when Yelena returned to the path, she found her boot prints exactly where she left them, ending abruptly mid-step, right where she'd stood still in the snow. But no second set of footprints. Nothing to show that anything, or anyone, had ever stood across from her. Only a circle of melted snow, where the air had shimmered, now frozen over with a strange, glassy crust. She reached out to touch it. The cold stung her fingertips immediately, like touching dry ice. It wasn't natural, and that whisper, it was still faintly ringing in her ears. Not as a sound anymore, but like an echo etched somewhere in her thoughts. A memory that didn't feel quite hers. Yelena said nothing to the villagers at first. What could she say, anyway? "Good morning, I may or may not have been brain-whispered to by invisible snow aliens." "No, thank you." But the strangeness didn't stop. In the days that followed, animals began to avoid that part of the woods entirely. Her dog refused to go near it, tail between legs, whining like a pup. Local birds detoured in the sky, forming awkward V's like they were dodging invisible walls. And every night for a week, her dreams were full of symbols, circles, spirals, triangles within triangles. She woke up each time with the same word on her lips, Belyet, which, of course, isn't a Russian word. Not in any dictionary, but she felt sure it meant something. Maybe a name, maybe a place. Now, fast forward a few months, winter loosened its grip, and spring melted away the signs. But not the memory. Yelena eventually confided in her uncle, a retired Air Force technician who once monitored Soviet radar stations. And he didn't laugh. He didn't call her crazy. Instead, he opened an old storage box and pulled out a declassified map from 1984. "There," he said, pointing to a remote, unmarked zone near the same forest trail. Unexplained aerial distortions. They called it a ghost corridor. Planes avoided it. Radios scrambled there. And sometimes, on the coldest nights, even we heard whispers through headsets with the batteries removed. Yelena said the hair on her arms stood straight up, not from fear, but recognition. The word came back louder than ever, Bellier. Not a word, maybe. A call sign. Now, here's where it gets eerier. A few years later, a pair of hikers from St. Petersburg took a wrong turn during a snow trek in that same region. They were found the next morning, huddled in an emergency shelter, visibly shaken but unharmed. When questioned, both spoke of hearing, you guessed it, whispers. Not threatening, they said, more like invitations. Like we were being politely asked to look up, one of them reported. And when they did, they swore they saw a shimmer in the sky shaped like a spire, turning slowly, like it was made of glass and stars. Both hikers described it independently, down to the rotating motion and the feeling of being observed, but not watched. One said it was like standing in front of a museum piece, except we were the exhibit. Now, here's the fun part. You might be wondering if something really is up there, gently nudging Russian villagers with ghost whispers. Why so subtle? Why the mystery? Well, maybe subtlety is the point. I mean, imagine being an interstellar tourist with a clipboard studying planetary life. Would you really want to land with spotlights and dubstep? Or would you try to blend in like a snowflake? To this day, Yelena still avoids that trail, though she swears it never felt dangerous, just unfamiliar. Like being invited into a library. It's where you don't speak the language, but you somehow understand the stories. And remember that word? Belyet? Well, here's the kicker. 2 amateur linguists who heard Yelena's tale found that in an obscure pre-Slavic root system, bel relates to white, light, or purity, and yet to being or presence. So loosely translated, Belyet might mean the light that is, or more poetically, the silent presence in the snow. Coincidence? Probably. Or maybe the most poetic alien calling card Russia's ever seen. But hey, next time you're in a snowstorm and the wind's just a little too still, and you feel like someone's watching gently from nowhere in particular, maybe just whisper back, quietly, just in case they're still listening. You never know. Maybe your words will melt into the frost and reach them. In the warm, golden heart of Zimbabwe, not far from the bustling city of Harare, there lies a school that was once like any other. The Ariel School. A peaceful little place with open fields, classroom blocks faded slightly by the sun, and children who spent their days learning, laughing, and occasionally whispering about the mysteries of grown-ups. You know, like how teachers somehow, always, know when you're chewing gum, or how math problems grow teeth and chase you in your dreams. But one morning in September 1994, something truly odd happened. Something no teacher could explain. Something even the loudest children grew whispery about. It began just after recess. The kids had spilled out onto the dusty playground. The teachers were in a staff meeting which, probably, involved tea, paperwork, and the eternal debate over whether the copier was actually broken or just playing dead again. So the children were momentarily unsupervised, basking in the sun and the freedom. Then they saw it. A flash of silver in the sky, not the sharp glint of a passing plane, and not the loping, lazy path of a bird. This moved differently. Too quick, too deliberate. It zigzagged over the treetops, as if it were unsure where to land. Some of the younger children thought it was a toy, maybe even a prank, but toys don't hum like that. They don't shimmer with heat, and they definitely don't land ever so softly. Just past the trees where the wild grass grows tall. About 60 children stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the spot. A few, as brave as anyone can be at 10 years old, tiptoed closer. That's when they saw the figures. Small, slender, moving like they weren't quite touching the ground. Their heads were large and smooth, eyes darker than night. They didn't walk so much as glide. And even though they didn't speak a word, the children later said they heard thoughts. Thoughts in their heads that weren't theirs. One girl, Emily, said it felt like a soft echo brushing the inside of her mind. The being, she called it that, not a person, sent her feelings, warnings, images of forests burning, oceans rising, and cities cracking open like eggshells underfoot. The world changing, unraveling. A message without sound, but with weight. Another boy said it was like dreaming while awake. The being didn't tell him anything specific. It just watched. Curious, calm, maybe even a little sad, like an adult realizing that the kids are playing with matches, and no one's put up a fire extinguisher. The encounter lasted only a few minutes, maybe 10, maybe 15. It's hard to know, especially when you're young and your concept of time exists somewhere between "are we there yet?" and "lunch is in how many hours?" Then, just as suddenly, the figures turned. The ship, if you could call it that, rose without a sound and zipped into the sky, vanishing as if swallowed by the blue. The kids ran, not away, but toward the school, toward the teachers who were only just emerging from their meeting. Their voices overlapped, like birds trying to outsing each other. We saw something. They had big eyes. It told me things. It looked inside my head. Naturally, the adults were skeptical. Children have wild imaginations, after all, and some of these were truly wild tales. But the kids didn't back down. They drew what they saw. 60 or so illustrations, most eerily similar. Slender beings, big black eyes, metallic craft. Not one crayon depiction of a saucer with a smiley face or a flying cow. These were detailed, consistent. The story caught the attention of Cynthia Hind, a local UFO researcher. She interviewed the children one by one, recording their accounts. Then came Dr. John Mack, a Harvard psychiatrist with a keen interest in these so-called encounters. He spoke with the children at length and found them honest, thoughtful, and not at all prone to fantasy. These weren't kids looking for attention. In fact, many were shy about what they saw. Not embarrassed, but aware that adults often chuckle when kids say strange things. And yet, they stuck to their stories. Decades later, as grown adults, they still do. Selma. Now a mother of 3 says she dreams about the being's eyes, not in a scary way, or like a face you saw once in a crowd but never forgot. Brian, who now works in environmental policy, says the images he received shaped his life. He felt that warning like a push, nudging him to care more, do more. The drawings they made all those years ago still exist. Faded now, sure, but vivid in message. The tall beings, the silver craft, the overwhelming sense that someone, was trying to say, please take care of each other, of your planet, of yourselves. And it's that message that keeps this story alive. Because, unlike most alien tales, this one wasn't about abductions, missing time, or blinking lights on radar. It was about connection. Children who were too young to lie with such consistency, too untrained to fabricate identical visions, and perhaps too innocent to dismiss the telepathic whispers that slipped quietly into their minds. Skeptics argue about the details. Could it have been mass hysteria? Could the kids have influenced each other? Certainly, that's a possibility. But even psychologists who reviewed the interviews found it difficult to dismiss how calm, clear, and consistent their testimonies were. It wasn't just what they said. It was how they said it. No drama, no desire for fame, just quiet truth, drawn in colored pencils. Some people say children see what adults cannot. That imagination is really just the brain's way of tuning into frequencies grown-ups forgot how to hear. That maybe, just maybe, truth sometimes arrives not with sirens and proof, but with drawings on notebook, paper, shared over recess, and remembered for a lifetime. If you think about it, the idea isn't so strange. We teach kids to believe in impossible things, talking animals, flying cars, time travel. Why is it then, when they tell us of a real moment, one they lived together, we choose to doubt it just because it doesn't fit? Perhaps that's the most alien thing of all. So tonight, as you drift off beneath your blanket cocoon, imagine that open field in Zimbabwe. Picture 60 children standing silently at the edge of the grass, the breeze warm, the sky a pale gold, and imagine them watching, unblinking, as something not of this world gently touches down, not to scare or conquer or abduct, but simply to see, to observe, to whisper softly into the minds of children. Maybe the message wasn't just for them. Maybe they were just the ones open enough to receive it. And maybe, even now, those beings are watching, not from above with lasers and intentions, but quietly, hopefully, like parents at Eat, the back of a school play, wondering if their little ones will remember their lines. The children who drew the sky did. And tonight, so do you. Now let that thought wrap around you like the softest quilt. Drift deeper. Let your breath slow. There are more stories waiting in the night. But for now, we rest with the children, with the drawings, and with the whisper of something far beyond. Nestled in the quiet hills of southeastern France, near the sleepy hamlet of Valençol, lavender fields stretch as far as the eye can. See, soft purple waves swaying under the Mediterranean sun. The air smells of blossoms and bees, and the silence is broken only by the occasional hum of cicadas or the distant clink of a shepherd's bell. It was 1965. The world was spinning fast with new ideas, space races, rock and roll, and rotary phones that sounded like tiny thunder when you dialed too quickly. But in Valençol, life moved at the pace of sheep. Enter Maurice Mas. He was a farmer, a man of routine, early riser, strong hands, probably had more conversations with his olive trees than with actual people, and that's not a joke. Those trees really do look like good listeners. Maurice was tending his lavender fields, same as always, when something strange happened. Something that would turn his life, and this little village, into one of the most enduring mysteries in France. Just after dawn, Maurice noticed a strange object in his field. At first, he thought it might be a broken helicopter or some odd kind of tractor. But as he stepped closer, he saw it was neither. The object stood on 4 legs, like a small round spaceship, white and smooth like porcelain, about the size of a compact car. Standing nearby were 2 beings. Not tall and majestic like sci-fi movies might suggest. No, they were small, child-sized, dressed in tight silvery suits that shimmered in the morning light. Their heads were large, bald, and shaped like upside-down teardrops, with no visible mouths or ears. Maurice froze, not out of fear exactly, but out of awe. You don't often see tiny space people on your land, after all. One of them turned and looked at him, and that's when everything slowed. Maurice later said he felt an overwhelming sense of calm, as if someone had pressed pause, not just on his body, but on his thoughts, too. He wasn't scared. He wasn't excited. He was quiet, still, like the whole world had taken a deep breath and stopped to listen. The beings studied the lavender for a while. Yes, even aliens appreciate good skincare ingredients, apparently. Then, without a word, they floated back into the craft. Maurice watched as it lifted silently into the sky, leaving behind only the scent of burnt grass and a deep impression in the soil. He didn't tell anyone right away. I mean, how do you start that conversation? Bonjour, I saw aliens, and they smelled like ozone? But the story eventually got out. Investigators arrived. They found the scorched earth, the circular marks, and Maurice's unchanged, unwavering account. He never sought fame, never asked for money. In fact, he grew quieter after the event, more introspective, as if he had been touched by something too big to explain, or perhaps something beautifully small. Years later, locals still whisper about it. Tourists visit the field. Children dare each other to stand in the spot where Maurice stood. And some say, on the stillest summer mornings, you can feel something there, like the earth holding its breath. Maybe it was all a dream, or a misidentification, or an echo of something long forgotten. But Maurice never changed his story. He said they were peaceful, curious, and that they left not just marks in the soil, but something gentle in his soul. So as you drift off now, imagine the warm wind rustling the lavender, the golden sun rising over sleepy hills, and one quiet man standing still as the universe briefly reached down, not to frighten, but to wonder. And maybe that's all we are sometimes, curious visitors walking through each other's gardens, leaving footprints and soft memories behind. Sleep now, shepherd of dreams. The field is quiet again. Some locals said Maurice never quite returned to the version of himself from before that morning. He still farmed, still harvested his lavender. But there was a new quiet to him, not the silence of fear, but the kind that comes from having glimpsed something beyond. Words, like the hush after a really good piece of music ends, and you don't want to break the spell just yet. He didn't tell stories at the local cafe like he used to. He'd smile politely when asked about it, sip his coffee slowly, and look at the hills as though they held some secret melody only he could hear. When investigators came from Paris, they expected exaggeration, or at least confusion. But Maurice remained consistent. The object, he said, didn't make a sound. The beings didn't speak, but he somehow understood them. Not in words, but in impressions. Calm, curiosity, the kind of focus you'd expect from a child meeting a new animal for the first time. Not threatening, just fascinated. They asked him what the beings looked like again, and Maurice, ever the practical man, said, like children, if children were carved from light and wrapped in aluminum foil. Chic, even by alien standards. The impression they left in the field was measured and photographed, 4 round indentations spaced evenly, and a central unexplained, scorched patch where the grass refused to grow for years. Soil samples showed signs of compression and heat, but no radiation, no tire marks, no signs of combustion. Just presence. As for the object itself, Maurice said it rose silently, tilted slightly to the left, as though it were politely waving goodbye, then shot straight into the air and vanished behind the morning clouds. The sheep never panicked. The birds didn't flee. It was almost as if nature itself understood. This wasn't danger. It was visitation. And maybe that's why the story persisted. Because it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was gentle, subtle, like something from a dream that lingers longer than it should. The kind that follows you into breakfast, brushing your shoulders like a breeze through lace curtains. Maurice lived a long life after that, but he never tried to monetize the story, never claimed prophecies or wrote books. When asked, years later, if he wished he had gotten a photo, he chuckled and said, "Would you ask for a photograph if a miracle knocked on your front door?" Touché, Maurice. And so the hills of Valençol remain, rolling and calm, dotted with olive trees and purple blooms, their silence only occasionally, broken by the wind and the soft clinking of distant bells. The field where the encounter happened is still visited, mostly by those who've read the story or heard it whispered across sleepy campfires. Sometimes, people report odd dreams after visiting the site. Dreams of standing in wide lavender fields under a silver dawn. Dreams where they feel seen, not by eyes, but by intention. Dreams where something otherworldly smiles, without a mouth, and says simply, "We're listening." And isn't that what we all want in the end? To be witnessed, not in judgment, but in curiosity. To be part of a moment so quiet and strange that it hums in your chest like the memory of a lullaby. Maurice's story doesn't end in fireworks or dramatic revelations. It ends in soft footsteps through the grass, a whisper between stars, and the belief that maybe the universe isn't cold or indifferent, but watching, waiting, wondering. And when it visits, it doesn't always come with flashing lights and loud declarations. Sometimes it comes on four legs, wrapped in silence, with hands the size of walnuts, and a fondness for lavender. Now, let that image float with you. The slow wind across sleepy French fields, the distant haze of olive branches swaying like sleepy dancers, the sky wide and waiting, like a page left blank just for you. Maurice stands there still in that morning light, one hand resting on his rake, the other shielding his eyes as the silver curve of something impossible lifts away. He doesn't wave. He just smiles. As if to say, "I saw you too. Sleep well now, wherever you are. The shepherd's field is quiet. The story is tucked in, and so are you." Nestled deep within the countryside of Yamagata Prefecture, where rice fields stretch like soft green quilts across the earth, lies a village so quiet, even the crows seem to whisper. This is the kind of place where the biggest news is usually about a misplaced tractor or the annual mochi-making competition. But in the early summer of 2003, something truly out of place visited this sleepy region. It began, as most good mysteries do, with a farmer. His name was Mr. Hoshino, a man who owned a pair of rubber boots more famous than he was. Hoshino was not one for exaggeration. He lived simply, tending his rice paddies by day and falling asleep to sumo reruns by night. But one morning, just after the golden glow of sunrise painted the fields, he noticed something odd. His prized rice plants, usually as uniform as soldiers in a drill, had bent. Not broken, not trampled, just bowed in a spiral. The spiral wasn't random. It was precise. Too precise. A smooth, mathematically perfect curve spun out from the center of the paddy, like someone had drawn a cosmic fingerprint into the landscape. And unlike prankster kids leaving behind bike tracks, this spiral had no entry or exit marks, just plants bent toward the soil, with no sign of damage. They weren't dead. They weren't even bruised. They looked like they were sleeping. Dreaming, maybe. Just like you are, right about now. Hoshino scratched his head, muttered something about teenagers with geometry fetishes, and trudged home to grab his old flip phone. He took photos. Grainy, of course. As grainy as the rice he would later sell at the town market. He shared them with his neighbor, a woman named Noriko, who ran the local stationery shop. Noriko, being more tech-savvy, meaning she knew how to use a fax machine, sent the images to a regional news outlet. And that's when things got a little glitched. Within 48 hours, a small team of government officials arrived. Not in suits, like you'd expect from Tokyo bigwigs, but in beige uniforms, the kind that look like they're either from pest control or an anime about bureaucratic time travelers. They introduced themselves as part of an agricultural preservation task force, which, to Hoshino's ears, sounded about as real as a dragon living in his barn. They asked some questions, took some soil samples, and left behind nothing, not even a thank you pamphlet. But they did caution Hoshino not to spread any rumors. Apparently, spiral rice is confidential. Here's where it gets weirder. Over the next few nights, people in the village began reporting strange flashes of light hovering above the fields. Not bright, invasive lights, just soft pulses, like bioluminescent jellyfish had taken to the sky. Silent, blue, gentle. One teenage boy, Kenji, said he saw a floating rectangle above the paddy, shimmering like static on a broken TV screen. It didn't move like a drone. It sort of jittered, as if reality itself couldn't load the image properly. The villagers began calling it the glitch. Not a UFO, not a spirit, just the glitch. A week later, the spiral was gone. Not just overgrown, but reversed. The plants had straightened themselves. On their own, no damage. It was as if the entire event had unhappened, like pressing CTRL plus Z on a rice paddy. Nature's undo button. But then came the drawings. Children at the local school started sketching strange shapes during art class. Not stick figures, not anime characters, nope. They were drawing those same spirals along with tall, faceless figures standing in the fields. Not scary figures, just watchers. They called them the Pale Ones. One child, little Miho, drew a scene of herself walking hand in hand with one of these pale beings through the fields under a starlit sky. Her teacher, Mrs. Tanaka, gently asked if it was a dream. Miho simply smiled and said, "No, it was real. They wanted to show me the sky from the other side." Now, I know what you're thinking. Kids have wild imaginations. They also think carrots are spicy and that the moon follows them home. But these drawings kept happening, unprompted, consistent, like they had all shared the same dream or the same glitch. Then came the power outages. Every time the lights blinked out at night, villagers would look outside and see that glow above the fields, just hovering, quiet, motionless. One evening, Hoshino swore he saw his scarecrow wave at it. He laughed, shook his head, and went back inside. But the next morning, the scarecrow was gone. No footprints, no theft, just a single rice stalk bent in a spiral where it once stood. As word quietly spread, a few amateur researchers showed up. One woman from Tokyo claimed to be a dimensional energy by cartographer, which is a fancy way of saying she believed places like Hoshino's field were fracture points in space-time. She camped out by the paddy with EMF readers, cameras, and a small collection of crystals. After 2 nights, she left abruptly, refusing to talk about what she'd seen. But she left behind her journal. In it, a single line. The field is not haunted. It's remembering something. Hoshino, for his part, remained mostly unfazed. He went back to farming. Rice waits for no mystery. But every now and then, he'd find tiny objects among the stalks, perfectly smooth stones shaped like teardrops, with no signs of weathering. One he kept in his coat pocket when held under moonlight. It shimmered faintly with colors no one could name. His granddaughter called it Star Candy. One late autumn evening, a visiting professor from Kyoto University came to interview Hoshino. He brought along some advanced equipment and tried to detect radiation or anomalies in the field. He found nothing unusual, except when he reviewed the audio recordings, he discovered a faint whisper layered beneath every clip. Not in Japanese, not even in any known language, just a soft, melodic murmuring, like someone humming lullabies backwards. He played it to a linguistics expert, who concluded, "It's not a message meant for us to understand. It's meant to be remembered." Now, no official report was ever published. The local authorities dismissed it all as community-wide hysteria. Too much sake, they joked, too many long walks in the sun. But the villagers know what they saw, what they felt, what their children still sometimes mention at dinner tables between bites of pickled plum and rice balls. And here's the part that might tingle your spine just a little. Every few years, always on the same night in late June, the field glows. Again. Just for a few minutes. Just enough to remind those still awake, still watching, that the glitch never truly left. Some villagers now treat it like a tradition. They lay out tatami mats, sit quietly in the dark, and sip tea while waiting. Not to investigate, not to solve anything, just to be present, to share space with something that doesn't need explaining. One elder calls it bowing to the unknown. Another calls it the yearly software update. So, if you ever find yourself wandering the Japanese countryside, and you stumble upon a rice field that seems a little too perfect, a little too symmetrical, maybe don't step inside. Just stand at the edge. Listen, and if you hear something, a whisper, a hum, a breeze that sounds like it's thinking, just smile, nod politely, and let the glitch pass through you. After all, not every error needs correcting. Some glitches are just reminders that reality is far more interesting when it forgets to behave. And as you slowly drift deeper into your own dream fields tonight, may your thoughts spiral gently, like rice bending toward the stars. New Zealand, the land of rolling hills and ancient whispers, where the air is crisp and scented with pine, and the fog drapes the land like a soft blanket. It's a place where myths and mountains live together, where Maori legends blend with the rhythm of the tides, and the stars above feel just a little closer to Earth. But even in a land as peaceful as this, sometimes, just sometimes, something glows in the mist. Our story begins in the remote South Island, in a place with more sheep than people and more fog than clarity. The year was 1981, though some locals swear it felt more like time had folded in on itself that night. The air was still, unnaturally so. No birdsong, no sheep bleating, not even the wind rustling through the ferns. Just silence and fog. Thick, clinging fog that curled around the trees and hovered above the damp grass, like a ghost who'd missed its train. A young man named Thomas Riwi, a schoolteacher who had just moved from Auckland, had been living in a small rental cottage, near the Milford Sound. He loved hiking, solitude, and an absurd amount of tea. On this particular night, Thomas was returning from a weekend camp with students. As he guided his beat-up Land Rover along the winding gravel roads, his headlights seemed swallowed by the mist. That alone would have been eerie enough, but then the radio hissed. Not the usual AM static. No, this was different. Rhythmic pulses, faint clicks. Then what sounded like a whisper, but not in English. Not in Maori. Not in anything Thomas recognized. And, just to clarify, Thomas wasn't the kind of man to be easily rattled. He once read ghost stories by candlelight during a power outage and laughed when the chimney howled. But this was different. He turned off the radio, assuming it was just interference. But then he saw them. Footprints. Luminous, glowing, floating, not pressed into the mud, but hovering a few inches above it. A trail of softly shimmering bluish-green, steps curving across the road in front of him and vanishing into the tree line. Naturally, being a curious man and possibly a little too, influenced by science fiction novels, Thomas stopped the car. Because that's what all horror movie protagonists do just before something weird happens. He stepped out, his boots squelching into the wet earth. The air was impossibly still. His breath fogged out before him, but the glowing footsteps seemed untouched by cold or humidity. They just hovered. With each step he took toward them, the hair on his arms stood a little taller. He followed them, because of course he did. The footprints led down a slope, into a small clearing, surrounded by silver beech trees. The mist swirled low along the ground, and the only sound was the quiet crunch of Thomas's boots. That, and the occasional muttered, "This is definitely how people go," missing forever, under his breath. And then he saw it. A sphere, hovering above the ferns, about the size of a small car, perfectly smooth and pulsating with soft violet and teal hues. It didn't make a sound. Not a hum, not a buzz, not a single beep. Clearly not manufactured by humans who seem to think every advanced thing needs a sound effect. The sphere just floated there, beautiful and still, hypnotic, like a lava lamp had achieved. Enlightenment. Thomas blinked, and then the footprints vanished. He looked down. Gone. Not even an afterglow. Just normal, muddy earth. And when he looked back up, the sphere was gone, too. Vanished without so much as a dramatic whoosh. He stood there for a moment, slightly offended by how anticlimactic the ending was. No abduction. No interstellar invitation. Not even a suspicious humming sound. Just fog again. And silence. He walked back to his Land Rover, feeling unsure if he'd actually seen anything, or if maybe the long weekend with chatty teenagers had finally broken his grip on reality. But something odd happened when he tried to restart the car. The engine sputtered and sputtered, and refused to turn over. It was a familiar problem, sure. But then the headlights flickered, and for a brief second the entire inside of the car was bathed in that same violet-teal glow he'd seen in the clearing. Just one pulse, then back to normal. The car started, as if nothing had happened. He didn't tell anyone at first, because how do you explain glowing footprints and floating orbs in the fog without being gently offered? Decaf and a long nap? But slowly, stories began to surface. Other hikers, locals, even a park ranger named Hannah, who claimed she once saw a trail of blue fireflies forming the shape of a human footpath near that same area. Everyone had a different take. One described the lights as dancing spirits, another thought it was some military experiment, while one particularly enthusiastic gentleman was convinced it was the New Zealand version of Bigfoot, but fashionable. Over the years, the tale of the luminous footsteps became one of those half-whispered stories told around campfires in Fjordland. The kind that makes you look twice into the fog, just in case something's watching back. Some tried to record them, to capture the phenomena on camera, but it never worked. Either the fog was too thick, or the camera batteries mysteriously died. One woman even tried to live-stream her hike. She got 3 minutes in before her phone screen went static and started playing the sound of marbles dropping. No one's really sure. Technology and paranormal stuff never seemed to get along. A few folklore experts proposed that the footprints were connected to ancient Maori legends about beings who could walk between worlds. Some said they were guides. Others believed they were watchers, slipping through from a parallel space just slightly out of sync with ours. There's even an old proverb from the area, "He hikoi matepo, a journey for the night," referring to steps taken not by the living, but by something else. Skeptics, of course, had their theories: bioluminescent fungus, unusual mineral deposits, overactive imaginations brought on by too much solitude and maybe a bit too much local cider. But here's the thing. Every sighting, every encounter came with the same. 3 details: thick fog, absolute silence, and a feeling like the world was watching you back. What's especially curious is that the footprints never led anywhere dangerous. No one went missing. No one was hurt. It was almost as if they were inviting, like a breadcrumb trail from another dimension that said, "Come see, but not too close." Years later, Thomas Rui still lives near that same cottage. He's older now, more skeptical of memory, but every once in a while, when the fog curls just right and the air turns still, he walks the old path near the beet clearing, just in case, not expecting anything, but maybe hoping for a second glance at something that wasn't meant to be seen. He keeps a journal now, a thick one, filled with accounts of foggy walks, strange lights, and quiet thoughts. Sometimes he doodles, orbs in the margins. Sometimes he draws footsteps. And always, always, he ends with the same note: "They didn't come back today, but I think they were close." What's more relaxing than thinking about that? The idea that maybe, just maybe, the universe occasionally steps down into our world, not with chaos or lasers, but with gentle lights in the fog and quiet invitations we barely notice. That some visitors prefer soft introductions, no crop circles, no dramatic entrances, just footprints and silence and maybe, just maybe, the hope that we'll look up and smile. After all, if you were an alien, wouldn't you also rather walk through the New Zealand countryside than, say, land in the middle of rush hour traffic in Tokyo? So next time you find yourself in a misty place, with fog thick enough to hide the stars, and the world feels a little quieter than usual, take a moment. Look down. You might just see them, glowing, floating footsteps, inviting you to take a sleepy little stroll toward the unknown. And don't worry, they probably won't abduct you. Probably. Somewhere in the rugged highlands of central Mexico, near the sleepy outskirts of the town of Tepoztlan, there is a tunnel, not listed on any map, not marked by any sign. Just a break in a rocky hillside, half covered with moss, partly obscured by vines, and entirely ignored by locals, unless you bring up the hum. Ah yes, the hum. In Tepoztlan, people talk about el zumbido. It means the buzzing in Spanish, a low, droning vibration that seems to come from deep underground, echoing late at night and fading by dawn. Some say it's geological. Others believe it's the whisper of ancestral spirits. But a few folks, those with wide eyes and cautious voices, they say it's not from Earth at all. Our story begins with a man named Mateo Luna. He wasn't a scientist, or a ufologist, or a conspiracy theorist. Mateo was a beekeeper, a humble one. His days were spent among buzzing hives, his nights tending a modest garden behind a small adobe, home. But one summer night in 1998, everything changed. Mateo was walking back from a friend's house just after midnight. He'd taken the long way home through a forest trail because, well, he was 3 cups of mezcal deep and feeling poetic. The air was heavy, the way it gets before a storm, except there were no clouds. Just stars, bright and crowding the sky like a party no one invited you to. That's when he heard it, the hum. Not like bees, not like anything he'd ever heard, really. It wasn't loud, but it felt physical, like something brushing against his bones from inside his chest. Curious and mildly annoyed, because only a beekeeper would be annoyed at a hum louder than his bees', Mateo followed the sound off the path. And that's when he found the tunnel. It was barely visible, sunken behind a curtain of ferns, but it pulsed with a strange light. Not a glow exactly, more like the rocks around it seemed brighter than they should be. He described it later as if the darkness was being painted over with a thin brush of moonlight. Now, you'd think most people would turn back, but Mateo, he did what anyone would do if they were full of mezcal and misplaced confidence. He walked in. Inside it was cool and dry. The hum got louder, but it didn't hurt. In fact, it felt oddly welcoming, like standing near a warm engine. The tunnel stretched down at a gentle slope, and the further he went, the more time seemed to blur. He couldn't tell if he'd been walking for 10 minutes or an hour. He wasn't even sure if his feet were touching the ground anymore. That's when he saw them. 3 figures, not tall, maybe the height of a child, but impossibly thin, like shadows that had skipped their meals. They shimmered slightly, like heat waves above pavement. No eyes, no mouths, but somehow he knew they were looking at him. Not threatening, just curious, as if they were wondering why a human had wandered into their hum tunnel on a Tuesday. Mateo said he felt a message inside his mind, something like, "You're not supposed to be here yet." And then everything snapped. He woke up face down at the entrance of the tunnel, mouth full of dirt, morning sun warming his back, bees buzzing faintly in the distance like they were gossiping about his night. The tunnel, gone, or rather, hidden again. The vines and moss had returned, sealing it up like nothing had ever happened. He went home, swore off mezcal for a month, and didn't tell anyone, until years later, when a traveling journalist from Spain came to Cadum Tepoztlan to write about ley lines and energy vortexes. Mateo casually mentioned his walk into the humming tunnel. The journalist listened, wide-eyed, and whispered, "You too?" It turns out others had heard of El Zumbido, a farmer in 1973, a teenage girl in 1986, even a tourist from Belgium who got lost while hiking in 2005. All had described the hum, a tunnel, and a message, not a voice, but an understanding. You're not supposed to be here yet. The government never commented on the area. There were no scientific expeditions, no UFO documentaries shot in the region. Which was strange, because in most parts of the world, a story like that would get scooped up and turned into at least 3 Netflix specials and a scented candle line. But here in Mexico, the land seems to protect its secrets, like the tunnel is alive and knows when to hide. A few years ago, a group of university students brought sound equipment to the hillside to record the hum. They set up microphones, sensors, infrared cameras, and stayed for 3 nights. On the 3rd night, their equipment stopped working for exactly 3 hours and 12 minutes. All of it. Batteries drained, clocks reset, footage wiped. The next morning, their van tires were rotated backward. They hadn't parked on a hill. Was it a prank? Maybe. A glitch in their equipment? Possibly. But they didn't go back. Not because they were scared. No, they said they felt watched. And worse, expected. Like the hum was a ticking clock, counting down to something. And that's the thing about El Zumbido. It's not loud, but it stays with you. It's not a sound. It's an invitation. Or maybe a warning. Or maybe both, depending on what you're doing when you hear it. Mateo's bees still buzz contentedly in his garden. He never heard the hum again, but sometimes he dreams of the tunnel, and the figures, and the message. You're not supposed to be here yet. Yet. That's the word that unsettles most people, because yet implies that someday someone will be. Maybe it's not us. Maybe it's not. Even humans. Maybe the tunnel isn't a place. It's a moment. A checkpoint in time. And the hum? That's the call. Like a text, message from the universe saying, "Hey, don't forget, something's coming." And maybe that something has been humming underneath us for centuries, waiting for its scene to start. So next time you're in a quiet place, and you feel a sound more than hear it, and the air seems to thrum with purpose, ask yourself, gently, is this the moment, or am I just not supposed to be here? Yet. But don't worry. If you are here, and you're hearing this, you're probably right on time. Even if the tunnel is still humming somewhere far away. High in the Cederberg Mountains of South Africa, where the sandstone peaks stretch like sleeping giants under layers of time, there lies a valley locals call Still Dry the Silent Bend. It's the kind of place that always feels like it's holding its breath. The wind moves differently here, softer somehow, almost like it's sneaking past your ears, whispering secrets you're not supposed to hear. And in this hidden valley, nestled between crimson rocks and wiry acacia trees, comes a story not many people have dared to tell. A story of a sound that wasn't a sound, a whistle that had no source, and lights that drifted like they were thinking. It's the story of the silent mountain whistle. The earliest written mention came from a colonial-era sheep herder, Jan Botha, in a letter dated 1876. Jan was no poet. His journal was mostly about the sheep eating too much, or not enough, or disappearing altogether. But on one page his handwriting turns erratic. He writes of a shriekless whistle, thin as thread, slicing the air, that circled his camp 3 nights in a row. He claimed even his dogs froze in place when it passed. The sheep, well, they baaed once, then lay down like someone had unplugged their batteries. Fast forward a century and a half, and you find the same reports, now typed in blogs or posted on fringe UFO forums. But the tone is strangely similar. Even digital age campers describe the same thing. A piercing high tone that doesn't come from anywhere, yet seems to move. One hiker said it was like the mountain was inhaling. But the strangest account by far comes from a geology student named Kotso Dlamini, who visited the valley in 1994 to study sediment layers for his thesis. He had set up camp near a cluster of unusually round boulders, which some speculated were prehistoric grinding stones. On his 3rd night, Kotso heard the whistle. He said it began not with sound, but with pressure, like someone pressing 2 cold coins against your temples. Then came the faint hum, like a singing wine glass. Not loud, not even clear. Just present. He described looking up and seeing something moving just above the valley floor, not in the sky, but almost skimming the earth, like fog with intent. He couldn't describe its shape. He said it wasn't a thing. It was a gap in the air, like if someone had carved a sliver out of the world and the edges didn't match anymore. He stood frozen, one sock on, one sock off, and watched it pass. No wind, no birds, no insects, just this drift. And as it moved, the whistle intensified not in volume but in clarity. He said it made him feel like he was being remembered by something old. Now, this might have ended there, a strange personal story to pass down at awkward family gatherings. But 2 weeks later, when he developed his camera film, yes, he was old school, like that, he found a frame that made no sense. A long exposure shot of the valley at dusk, and in the middle of it, a perfect vertical streak of white-blue light, about 30 feet tall, no distortion, no flare, just there. Clean. Undeniable. The rest of the photo was dull and yellowed, as if the light had drained the color from everything around it. He mailed it to a local university. They assumed it was a developer error, maybe static on the film. But one professor, Dr. Adediji, a seismologist who'd heard whispers of this whistle, took a second look. He enhanced the grain structure and found something odd. The light in the photo didn't reflect on the ground. It bent the grass shadows toward it, as if light had reversed its manners and started pulling instead of pushing. That's when things got a little more official. A team of amateur investigators, led by a quiet astronomer named Lena Jacobs, decided to camp in the Silent Bend during the full moon of 1996. They brought EMF detectors, long-range microphones, and what they called a discreet curiosity, which, basically, meant they promised not to make fools of themselves if nothing happened. But something did. On their second night, at 3:14 a.m., which, fun fact, is exactly pie time. Not that aliens care about our math, the microphone picked up a high-pitched whistle that traveled in a perfect circle around their camp. It wasn't wind, it wasn't mechanical, and it wasn't audible to human ears. But their dog, Tambo, stood up and pointed north every time the sound completed a loop. They followed it. Yes, they followed a sound they couldn't hear, guided only by the posture of a medium-sized mutt with questionable vision. And about 400 meters up a slope, near a rock shaped uncannily like a human ear, not even kidding, they saw it. A shimmer. Not quite visible. More like something that didn't belong being outlined by what did. Lena described it as a tear in the story, and as they approached, they saw footsteps glowing faintly in the dust, each one lighting up for a moment before fading. Not prints, not indentations, just light where nothing had walked. The group stood in silence, because what else do you do when your whole understanding of gravity, biology, and reality politely excuses itself for the night? They recorded everything. The humming, the prints, the echo pattern of their own breathing bouncing wrong off the rocks. But when they returned home, the tapes were fine, boring, ordinary. No hum, no footsteps, just a lot of whispering and someone unzipping a sleeping bag way too loudly. All they had left was memory. And memory, well, it's as slippery as fog in the Cedarburg. Still, whispers spread. In 1999, a group of indigenous San elders were consulted, and one elder quietly nodded when shown the light photo. He said it matched an old story of sky dancers, spirits that traveled by sound and light and could not be seen unless they chose to be. He warned, they do not like being chased. Not threatening, just firm, like a mountain's advice. Today, some hikers claim to hear the whistle still, especially in winter, when the air is dry and sound travels like a ghost looking for somewhere to land. A few have reported dreams after hearing it. Dreams of landscapes that bend upward at the edges. Of animals, shaped wrong, like God made them on a Sunday evening after a nap. Of doors that open into nothing but feel important. Skeptics say it's all exaggeration. Sound tricks, optical illusions, maybe even gas pockets under the mountain. One YouTuber suggested a malfunctioning drone. Another said it's all just clever local tourism marketing because what better way to sell hiking, boots, than to throw in a free interdimensional whistle? But for those who've been there, the feeling lingers, that something ancient moves through that bend. Something that isn't interested in being understood. Something that glows only when no one's looking directly at it. Like truth, or you're missing socks. So if you ever find yourself in the Cedarburg, and the air gets thin, but you're not out of breath, and the wind sounds like it's spelling, your name in Morse code, maybe stop and listen, not with your ears, but with whatever part of you still remembers what silence felt like before language. And if you hear that whistle, the one that doesn't whistle, don't be afraid. Don't run. Just lie down in the grass, look up at the stars, and let the mountain hum you to sleep. In the vast and whispering sands of the Thar Desert, where the night wind carries stories older than memory, and the stars glow like lanterns for the lost, there lingers a tale quiet, strange, and almost forgotten. It's not a story told over chai at roadside dabas, nor is it printed in newspapers lining the shop fronts of Mithi or Islamkot? No, this is the kind of tale told in low voices, under shawls, while the embers of the fire still glow and the goats have gone quiet. The kind that leaves you looking at the horizon a little longer than usual. Our story begins on the outskirts of a tiny village so small, in fact, that it barely shows up on Google Maps. Tucked between rolling dunes and thorny kedri trees, it was a place where life moved slowly, the kind of place where the arrival of a new radio was still a topic of conversation days later, and a motorbike passing by was enough to send children chasing after it in giddy excitement. One night, in the late spring of 1994, something changed. The winds, usually warm and dry, carried with them an odd chill. The desert animals, ever attuned to the smallest shifts, grew restless. Dogs whined, goats refused to settle, and even the lizards that clung to cool walls seemed uneasy. A man named Fahim was the first to notice it. He was the kind of man who rarely noticed anything beyond his herd of camels, and the persistent rattle in his old radio. But that night, as he sat alone with his hookah, staring up at the sky, something caught his eye. A flicker, then a pulse, then a floating amber glow hovering low over the sand dunes, not fast like a jet, nor loud like a helicopter. Just quiet, unnaturally quiet. Now, Fahim wasn't the superstitious type. He believed in hard work, camel milk, and that one day maybe the government would fix the village's only bore well, but glowing orbs hovering above the desert, that was above his pay grade. He watched it, mesmerized, as the orb slowly descended toward the edge of the village, near the old dry well that hadn't seen water in years but still served as a gathering place for kids playing hide and seek. The light dimmed but didn't vanish. Instead, it hovered just above the cracked earth, humming a sound that wasn't quite audible, but seemed to tickle the back of Fahim's skull. He rubbed his eyes. Then he did what any self-respecting man of the desert would do. He went to fetch his cousin. Shahid was younger, louder, and endlessly fascinated with sci-fi comic books he somehow managed to get from Karachi. He had once tried to build a telescope using a broken flashlight and a pair of old eyeglasses, so naturally, when Fahim banged on his door, shouting about light balls in the sand, Shahid assumed it was either a dream or Fahim had finally lost it. But curiosity, especially when combined with cousinly obligation, is a powerful motivator. The two of them crept out under the starlight, the sand cold beneath their feet. When they arrived near the well, the orb was gone, or so it seemed. They stood there, quiet, listening. The wind had stopped completely. Even the insects, usually chirping their tiny nightly symphonies, had gone mute. Then came the sound, a low vibrating whistle, not from the sky, but from beneath their feet. A sound that made their teeth itch and their hearts race. And then the ground shimmered, like heat rising off a road, but inverted. And from that shimmer, a figure emerged. Not walking, not floating, more like flickering, between dimensions. It stood maybe 7 feet tall, its form long, thin, wrapped in something that moved like cloth, but shimmered like fish scales. Its eyes, or what passed for them, were black voids, not menacing, not glowing, just endless. Neither Fahim nor Shahid screamed. Maybe they were too scared, maybe they were too stunned, or maybe just maybe they felt something deeper, something that whispered, "Don't run, just watch." The figure raised one arm, not threateningly, more like an invitation, or a greeting. Then it turned, moving toward the edge of the dune. But instead of walking, it dissolved with each step, trailing particles of light like burning sand in the wind. And then it was gone. The sound stopped. The night resumed. A lizard darted across the ground. Somewhere in the distance, a camel groaned. The world, as it always does, pretended nothing had happened. Fahim and Shahid stood in silence for what felt like hours. When they finally returned to the village, they didn't speak of it, not that night, not the next day. It wasn't fear that held their tongues. It was something else, a sort of reverence, like they had witnessed, something they didn't want to spoil with words. Eventually, of course, the story came out, whispered to friends, to cousins, to the occasional traveler, each time slightly changed. Maybe the figure had wings. Maybe it spoke in a language that echoed inside their heads. Maybe there were two of them. You know how stories go. Years later, A visiting professor from Karachi, Dr. Naila Zubair, came through the area to study the oral traditions of desert communities. She heard the tale from a young girl whose grandmother had been Shahid's neighbor. Dr. Naila, intrigued, visited the site. She took readings with instruments too sensitive for the human eye. What she found puzzled her. Localized electromagnetic anomalies, residual radiation too weak to be dangerous but too odd to be ignored, and the faintest traces of scorched earth in a perfect circle, now covered by the shifting sands. She tried to file a report, but you know how bureaucracy works, or doesn't. What makes this tale even stranger is that, over the years, others came forward. A shepherd, in 2003, who swore his herd had been rearranged into perfect spirals one morning. A group of school kids, in 2011, who saw lights dancing across the sand, chasing each other like fireflies before vanishing into the sky. A night watchman, in 2019, who claimed the stars above the dunes rearranged themselves into symbols for just one night. And always the same feeling reported afterward, a deep sense of calm, of having witnessed something grand, but gentle, like the universe had peeked in, said hello, and slipped away before anyone could reach for a camera. Of course, skeptics have had their fun. Weather balloons, secret military exercises, electrical faults, sleep paralysis, the usual suspects. But none of them explain the humming, or the electromagnetic anomalies, or how Shahid, who couldn't draw a straight line to save his life, suddenly began sketching strange geometric patterns for weeks afterward, symbols that, years later, were found to resemble ancient Proto-Indus carvings from Harappa. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe, just maybe, the Thar Desert, with all its silence and space, is the perfect hiding place for memories, for mysteries, for visitors who walk without feet and glow without fire. After all, the desert keeps its secrets well. And even now, as you listen, somewhere in those rippling sands, another glow might be rising. Quiet, patient, waiting for another. Fahim to look up and wonder. And should you ever find yourself beneath those same stars, wrapped in a shawl with nothing but sand for miles, listen closely, for the wind may whistle, but beneath it, the earth might still hum. Somewhere far up in the northern reaches of Canada, just outside the sleepy little town of Dawson, in the Yukon Territory, there exists a stretch of land so blanketed in snow for most of the year that locals joke it's more ice than earth. Here, the stars sparkle like they've just come out of a washing machine, extra shiny and a bit dizzy. And when the silence settles in, it's the kind of quiet that makes your ears listen harder, even though there's nothing to hear. At least, usually. But one winter night in 1996, that silence blinked. Our story begins with a man named Eric Beaumont. Eric wasn't particularly eccentric. He wasn't a conspiracy theorist, nor did he own a telescope or keep tinfoil in places other than the kitchen drawer. He was a forestry worker, a lover of maple syrup, and a proud owner of 3 dogs who all looked like they were always mid-nap. Eric lived alone in a log cabin that creaked in ways he'd grown to find comforting, like an old friend grumbling in their sleep. That night, temperatures had dropped to an almost comical minus 38 degrees Celsius. The kind of cold where the air tastes like metal and your eyelashes threaten to freeze together when you blink. Eric had just stoked his wood stove and was settling in with a book he had no intention of finishing when something outside caught his attention. It wasn't a noise, more of a shift in the atmosphere. Like when someone walks into a room without saying a word, but you can still feel their presence. His dogs, usually oblivious to everything that didn't involve food or squirrels, had lifted their heads in unison. Their ears perked, not growling, not whining, just alert. Still. Eric stood up and walked to the window. the cold glass humming gently against his forehead. What he saw made him frown, and then squint, and then wonder if maybe the cold had finally gotten to his brain. Hovering above the snowfield that stretched behind his home was a light. Not just any light. This was an impossibly white, shimmering sphere about the size of a minivan. It hovered without any apparent support, without movement, without making a sound. The snow beneath it hadn't melted. No engine hummed. No wind stirred. It just existed. And then it blinked. Not like a flicker from a faulty bulb or a twinkle from a far-off plane. It blinked like an eye, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging his gaze. One blink. Then stillness again. Eric blinked back, involuntarily. He chuckled softly, unsure whether he was amused, afraid, or simply frozen stiff. He walked out, onto his porch, his boots crunching softly in the snow, the boards creaking under his weight. The air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. He watched the sphere for what felt like hours, though it was likely minutes. Then, without warning, it moved, so smoothly, so swiftly, it seemed to leave a blur behind it like a skipped frame in a movie. It darted to the left, then right, then up, each movement, impossibly fast and silent. It didn't cast a shadow. It didn't cause wind. And yet, Eric could feel something from it, like a hum, not in his ears but in his bones. And just as suddenly it disappeared, not by flying away, not by dimming, it simply blinked out of existence. Eric stood there, breath steaming in the air, blinking again, wondering if he'd finally dozed off standing up. He wasn't scared. He wasn't even confused. He just felt oddly at peace, as if something had come and checked in on the world like a celestial librarian, peeking in to ensure everything was still where it belonged. But the story doesn't end there. The next morning, Eric found something strange in the snow behind his cabin. A perfect circle, about 10 feet wide, where the snow had slightly sunken, like a shallow impression from an invisible bowl. Around the edges, the snow glistened differently, as if it had been arranged by unseen hands. No burn marks, no footprints. Just that faint, luminous indentation. Now, Eric wasn't the kind of man to tell stories, but this one itched at him. Not in a bad way, but like a pleasant curiosity he couldn't scratch. Eventually, he told his neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Mabel, who wore more scarves than seemed necessary and had a passion for knitting and hot gossip. Mabel, naturally, told her cousin in Whitehorse. Her cousin, who happened to write for a small northern newspaper, told everyone else. Soon, Eric had visitors. Quiet, well-dressed men who didn't blink enough and asked a lot of questions without writing anything down. They thanked him politely, inspected his snow with very serious instruments, and left without ever saying what they thought it was. Eric offered them coffee. They declined. But here's where it gets more curious. Over the next 3 weeks, strange things began happening in and around Dawson. A snowplow driver reported seeing orbs hovering above the treetops just before sunrise. A group of ice fishers found their compasses spinning wildly before suddenly correcting themselves. And one night, a high school student snapped a photo of a glowing streak in the sky, one that didn't match any known satellite, meteor, or drone. Of course, it was blurry. They always are. It's like alien tech comes with built-in anti-focus fields. Local authorities shrugged. Scientists offered theories involving weather balloons, static charges, swamp gas, which, let's be honest, seems like a stretch when everything's frozen solid. Eric, meanwhile, simply went back to chopping wood and warming his cabin. But quietly, in his private moments, he'd think about the blink, the way it had felt so deliberate, like it had noticed him, like it was saying hello, or goodbye, or perhaps something in between. Years later, Eric moved into town, and his cabin sat empty. Locals still talk about that night. Some say the sphere comes back every few years, always silent, always white, always blinking. One boy, now grown, swears he saw it once, too, when he'd been sledding late one winter evening. He said it hovered behind the owl, hills just out of reach, watching. He didn't feel scared, he said, just understood, whatever that means. And in a town where snowfall buries the roads and winter stretches its arms across half the year, that blink became legend. Not quite frightening, not quite explainable, just one of those cold northern secrets that wraps itself in the silence and waits patiently for another winter night to stretch long enough for someone to notice. They say the snow up there holds memories, and when you walk through it, your footsteps are heard by more than just the trees. That somewhere out in the frozen breath of the land, something listens, watches, blinks. Maybe it's still there, waiting, hovering, blinking quietly just above the snow. Or maybe it was never really about being seen. Maybe it just wanted to see us, in that gentle, silent way only the coldest places seem to understand. Either way, if you ever find yourself walking alone through the snowfields of the Yukon on a night too cold for dreams, and you catch a glimpse of light hanging impossibly still in the sky, try blinking back. You never know what might be looking. Lake Como rests quietly, cradled among the Alps like a shimmering mirror. At night, the waters hold a sort of secret stillness. Locals say it's always been this way, whispery winds, dancing mist, and a peace that sinks into your bones. But once, long ago, that peace was interrupted by something strange. Not loud, not violent, but unmistakably otherworldly. It began on a cool spring evening in 1973. The town of Belano, a small lakeside village on the eastern shore of Lake Como, was winding down. Candles flickered in the windows. Couples strolled lazily along cobbled paths, gelato cups in hand. Somewhere a Vespa purred in the distance. And up the hill, near a small vineyard, a retired radio technician named Marco Bellini sat fiddling with his old ham radio. It was more of a hobby than anything else, a way to pass the time, listen to distant voices, or tune in to the static hum of the universe. Marco was a quiet man, widowed, curious, and slightly obsessed with fixing things that didn't need fixing. His tiny workshop was cluttered with soldering irons, dusty transistors, and stacks of unlabeled cassette tapes. That night, Marco tuned in to a frequency he'd labeled dead, a channel he'd marked as silent for years. Nothing ever came through. On it, not even white noise. But he was bored, and boredom is sometimes the doorway to discovery. At first, there was nothing. Then, a crackle. Then, something strange. A sound, faint but rhythmic. Not quite Morse code, not quite music. It was more like a language, or a heartbeat. A pulsing signal that repeated every few seconds. Marco leaned closer, adjusted the dials, tapped the side of his headphones like that would magically improve reception. The signal didn't change. It stayed soft, but steady, calm, like breathing. He recorded it without thinking. Not because he knew it was special, but because that's what Marco did. He recorded everything, even the silences. For the next hour, the signal stayed. No voice, no pattern, just that slow, steady rhythm. Then it stopped. Marco didn't tell anyone the next morning. He just walked to the lakeside cafe, ordered his espresso, and pretended he hadn't heard, something that didn't belong to this world. But that evening, curiosity won again. He tuned in. The signal was back, identical, as if the lake itself was breathing beneath the surface. On the third night, it changed. A single tone followed the pulse, higher in pitch, clearer, and then a whisper, barely audible. It wasn't Italian, or English, or anything Marco could place. But it wasn't random. It felt purposeful. like someone or something was trying to be understood. This time, Marco told someone. He walked down to the village library and met with Elena, a linguist who had returned from Milan to care for her elderly mother. She was skeptical and curious, a dangerous combination when mysteries are involved. Marco played the tape. Elena leaned forward, brows furrowed. It sounds like tonal inflection, maybe a proto-language or a mimic of one. I think it's from the lake, Marco said, eyes wide, or beneath it. Elena gave him a look, the kind people give when they want to believe something, but know they probably shouldn't. Still, she came back the next night. They listened together. The tone returned. Then, the whisper. Elena's face changed. Marco, it repeated. That word, whatever it is. She scribbled it down phonetically. Urakal. Marco repeated it. The radio flickered. The lights in his workshop dimmed. They didn't speak after that. The next few days, things got stranger. People reported lights over the lake. Not fast-moving UFOs, not glowing disks, just hovering. Spheres, soft and silent. Sometimes red, sometimes white. Fishermen said their compasses spun in circles when the lights appeared. One even claimed his boat drifted sideways, upstream against the current. One child drew a picture of the lake with glowing footprints on the water, like someone had walked across it barefoot. Elena and Marco, now firmly co-investigators in this accidental expedition, documented everything. They kept journals, compared notes. Marco even tried broadcasting a reply into the signal. Just the word Elena had written, Orakal. The signal stopped for weeks. It returned one final time the night of the summer solstice. This time, it wasn't just sound. Marco's old TV, long disconnected, lit, up with static. Lights in the village flickered. The lake, usually smooth as silk at dusk, rippled like something had stirred from the deep. And then came the hum. Not from the radio, not from the TV, but from the air. A low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from inside the chest. Like standing near a giant bell that's just been rung. It lasted exactly 7 minutes. After that, everything went silent. Marco never heard the signal again. Elena returned to Milan. She published nothing. But in her notebook, found years later by her niece, there was one final note. It said, "The voice was not a voice. It was thought-made sound." The tape? Gone. Marco had hidden it somewhere, or perhaps destroyed it, unsure of what it truly was. His workshop became quiet, again filled with half-finished projects and a dusty radio that never spoke again. But sometimes, late at night, visitors to Lake Como swear they hear something, a rhythm, a faint whisper, as if the lake is remembering a conversation it once had with the stars. Some say Marco imagined it all. Others say the frequency was a side effect of atmospheric pressure. But every now and then, a new ham radio enthusiast tries that same frequency and reports a flicker, a click, a moment of déjà vu. And when they do, they almost always describe hearing something that doesn't quite sound like language, but feels like it might be. There's even a legend now, a local myth passed around campfires and lakeside dinners, that if you stand on the northern dock at midnight on the longest day of the year and whisper Orakal into the breeze, you might just hear a reply. Maybe nothing happens. Maybe the night just stays quiet, like it usually does. Or maybe, for a moment, the air hums, the lake stirs, and the signal forgotten by most remembers you. Because some signals aren't meant for the world, just for those who choose to listen. And perhaps, just perhaps, that's all the aliens ever wanted. Not to invade, not to abduct, not to be feared. Just to be heard. And here, among the quiet mountains and the sleeping waters of Lake Como, maybe someone finally listened. Maybe the night just... Out in the Australian outback, the night is a blanket of deep navy blue, speckled with stars so clear and so close. They almost seem to whisper. The land stretches endlessly in every direction. Red sand, dry grass, eucalyptus trees swaying in slow rhythm with the breeze. It's a place where silence isn't empty. It's full of memory, of whispers, of stories that seem to hang in the air long after the people who told them have gone. This is where the story begins. Not in a city, not on a coast, but hundreds of miles inland near a forgotten cattle station called Moomba Ridge. The year was 1991. 3 friends, Layla, Mick, and Jono, decided to take a camping trip before they all went their separate ways. Layla had a job lined up in Sydney. Mick was heading to the mines. Jono wasn't sure yet. He just knew the outback. Calmed him. Made him feel like he belonged somewhere. They packed light some sausages, a 6-pack, sleeping bags, and an old Toyota Land Cruiser that coughed with every gear change. They drove deep into the bush, chasing the kind of silence you can't find near towns, the kind of silence where the only sound is your own heartbeat and the occasional howl of a distant dingo. They found a clearing near a dry creek bed, pitched their tents, and lit a fire as the sky shifted from golden pink to star-flooded black. The flames crackled. Shadows danced along the dusty ground. It was calm, so very calm. They laughed, told stories, passed around a rusted harmonica no one could really play. It was the kind of night you forget to photograph because you think it'll last forever. At around midnight, Layla stood and walked toward the trees to use the bathroom, just a few steps into the brush. She took her flashlight, a small one, and disappeared behind a bend in the path. She didn't come back. Not after 5 minutes. Not after 10. Mick called out, "Layla?" No answer. Jono grabbed the backup flashlight and went after her. Mick stayed near the fire, thinking maybe she'd just gone a bit farther than expected. But then something strange happened. The fire dimmed. Not flickered. Not faded from lack of wood. It dimmed all at once, like someone had turned the brightness down, the way you dim a lamp indoors. Mick stood, heart thudding. The air felt thick. The stars above seemed blurry, like someone had placed a thin film over the sky. And then came the hum. A low, vibrating tone that didn't come from anywhere, yet was everywhere. It wasn't loud, it wasn't threatening, but it was there, pressing in on the edges of reality. Mick backed away from the fire. Jono returned moments later, breathless. "She's not there," he said. "I followed the path. It loops back. No tracks. No sign of her." "But she had the torch," Mick said. "She did, but there's nothing. No light. No sound." They both stood in silence, watching the dimmed flames of their campfire flicker nervously. Then, above them, just past the treetops, a light appeared. Not a beam, not a spotlight. It was like a glowing coin, circular, pale, silent, hovering just above the canopy. The hum intensified. Jono whispered, "We should go." But they couldn't move, not out of fear, out of something else. Like the air was thicker now, like the weight of a dream pressing on your chest before you wake up. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. And so did the hum. The fire roared back to life. The stars above sharpened again. But Layla was gone. They searched the whole area, called out until their voices were hoarse. No signs of struggle, no animal prints, nothing broken. Nothing left behind but her footprints leading into the bush. No return prints, as if the world had simply stopped existing beyond that point. They drove into town the next morning red-eyed, silent, shocked. The local police wrote it up as a possible abduction, maybe a wild animal. But there were no drag marks, no blood, no signs of attack, just absence. Mick and Jono never returned to that campsite. For years, the story drifted between rumor and memory. But then, in 2003, something strange happened. A backpacker named Clara, hiking alone in the region, claimed she woke up one night to a strange light over her tent. No sound, no movement, just a hovering orb spinning slowly above the eucalyptus trees. She watched it for several minutes, too stunned to move. Then it blinked and vanished. The next day, she followed the trail toward the old Moomba Ridge clearing. There, in the center of the dust, she found a burnt patch in the exact shape of a circle. Not scorched, not from fire. More like the grass had simply ceased to exist, turned to ash with surgical precision. She reported the sighting. Locals shook their heads. "You're not the first," one man told her, "and you won't be the last." Over the years, others came forward. Campers who heard humming in the night, hikers who saw flickering lights that followed them, along ridge lines. One even reported hearing a voice in a dream. A soft female voice, repeating a phrase he couldn't remember after. Waking. Only the feeling remained warm, gentle, and profoundly alien. Then came the final twist. In 2018, a prospector named Bill Davies stumbled upon something strange buried under a dry riverbed near the site. It was an old, flashlight corroded, broken, and barely recognizable. But inside the casing, under layers of rust and dust, was a single scratched word on the handle. Layla. They matched the serial number to a batch sold in 1990 in Adelaide. There were no signs of human remains, no bones, just the flashlight. Bill, a skeptic by nature, later admitted that after finding the flashlight, he experienced strange dreams for weeks. Always the same. Scene. A campfire in the middle of nowhere. A woman's voice whispering, "It's not gone. It's just somewhere else." He left the outback a year later and never returned. So what happened that night in 1991? Some believe Layla stumbled into an underground cave system and was never found. Others say it was a case of foul play, covered by wild stories. But those who have camped out near Moomba Ridge, who've heard the hum, seen the lights, and felt the weight of that deep, watching silence, they say something else. They say the land remembers. That sometimes, on the anniversary of her disappearance, the fire will dim for no reason. The air will thicken, and for a moment, just a moment, you'll feel like you're being watched by something too big to comprehend. Not malevolent, just curious. And if you listen closely enough, you might hear a voice on the wind, a voice that doesn't come from behind you, but from above. Calm, gentle, calling you by name, even though you've never been here before. Maybe Layla never really left. Maybe she became part of whatever it was that touched this place. Or maybe some encounters aren't meant to be understood. They're meant to be felt. Out here, under the stars, by the flicker of a campfire that sometimes dims without warning, the story is still being told. Softly, quietly, to anyone willing to listen. And now, as our journey across this mysterious starlit planet draws to a close, we drift gently back from the wind-swept dunes of the Thar Desert, the frozen lakes of Canada, and the silent whistles of South African mountain tops. We've floated across rivers lit by glowing orbs in Brazil, followed footsteps in the mist of New Zealand, and listened to the forgotten echoes of signals across the quiet waters of Lake Como. And through it all, the earth has whispered soft, strange truths in places the world forgot to look. Each story was a quiet ripple in the great pond of the unknown stories that never made the headlines, sightings buried beneath time, laughter, disbelief, or fading campfire smoke. But still they linger, tucked into the corners of cultures, childhood memories, or quiet glances between those who saw something they couldn't explain, yet never quite forgot. And maybe that's the wonder of it all, that this planet so rich with history, life, and layers still carries these gentle anomalies. Not loud, not demanding, just present, like a shimmer in the air, A hum beneath the forest. A blink in the night sky. Maybe aliens. Don't always land in crashing saucers. Maybe sometimes they watch from shadows, step softly through fog, or leave tiny glowing footprints we mistake for dreams. You've traveled far tonight without ever leaving your bed. From Japan's glitching fields to Zimbabwe's schoolyard sketches, from Russian forests thick with snow whispers to tunnels in Mexico that hum when the stars align. Perhaps you felt the breeze shift with each tale, or heard the hush between words stretch a little longer as your eyelids grew heavy. That was the idea, to wander through mysteries as soft as clouds, as comforting as nightfall, as gentle as memory. And as you drift deeper into sleep now, know this: the world is full of secrets, but not all of them are frightening. Some are peaceful, curious, patient. Like us, maybe they just want to be understood. Some might wait hundreds of years in the branches of trees, in cave walls, in radio waves lost in deep space. Others perhaps visit only to listen, to feel, to pass quietly, unnoticed, like a breeze across your pillow. Wherever you are tonight, in the cities, in the villages, by oceans, deserts, forests, or snow, there may be something looking up, at the same sky, or something looking down. We are not alone, not in wonder, not in dreaming, and maybe, just maybe, not in the universe either. So close your eyes now, if you haven't already. Let your mind gently replay the softest of these stories, or let them fade like vapor in morning sun. You don't need to hold on to them. Just let them drift, the way stars drift across the edge of the atmosphere, quietly, calmly, as if they know something we don't but trust that we'll understand one day. Thank you for wandering with me. Sleep well, dream kindly, and wherever you go in your dreams, may the stars guide you home.